We've entered the last stage of prehistory, and Scotland's Celtic nations have begun to emerge. Yerahead saw Santa Shron Machar Jane. This is a history of Scotland. After a period of expansion fueled by the Bronze Age, the tiny coastal populations in Scotland began to develop a culture of farming and trade. But the Bronze Age collapse had destroyed those trade links, and in the face of starvation, Scotland retreated back to the coasts, and the fragile world they had created vanished. What follows is rather as expected. Populations declined, warfare bloomed, and Scotland fell into chaos. Without reserves of grain or a strong society to fall back on, Scotland again would need to be rescued by a new people, this time the Celts. The origin of the Celts. Short confession first. I've wanted to make this episode for a very long time. It probably predates this channel. Raised on a steady diet of Asterix and Caesar, I've been fascinated by the Celts. The epic battles, the druid cults, the Fiannas, the clans, the gold, the magic, the heroes, Cuchulainn, Vercingetorix, the brothers MacEacha and Cadwallon. But when I sat down to make this episode, I realised I couldn't even answer the first question. Why did the Celts go to Britain? This is a question at the root of the Celtic problem. As I researched this episode, I found that in order to explain the complex and often confusing history of the Celts, I needed to re-evaluate many of my assumptions about them. Many of the problems that we have come from the sources that we use. Most of our knowledge of the early Celts comes from the Romans, whose first interactions with these fun-loving folk was when they helped wreck the neighbouring Etruscans and burned Rome to the ground around 385 BC. Not exactly the best for first impressions. And so by the Romans we're told that the Celts are a barbarian people who submerge victims alive in bogs, charge recklessly into fights, hold their women in common, and live isolated in the forests. But of late, other sources have emerged. Belgian coins, Greek writers like Pythias, and archaeological evidence that paints a more frustrating and conflicting history. The simplest fact is that most of what the Romans told us was probably true, but they never bothered to look deeper than they had to, and left huge gaps in our understanding. In our last episode, we talked about how the Celtic Hallstatt culture had emerged from the earlier Urnfield and Tumulus cultures. As a little more background, the Tumulus culture appears to be one of the fusion cultures created by the Beaker people of Iberia and the corded wire people of the Transcaspia. The Tumulus was one of those ubiquitous Indo-European peoples who would eventually conquer the entirety of the continent, but at the time they were small, mashed between various Basques, Illyrians, Pelagians, Aquitanians, and various other groups that were competing for the power. The Tumulus and the succeeding Urnfield began a process of expansion fueled by agriculture and bronze, but in the wake of the Bronze Age collapse, these groups fractured. Hallstatt was in the middle of this chaotic landscape, and its Celtic people were profoundly impacted. The basis of Celtic life was the pagus. Anyone with an acquaintance with Latin probably saw that this word means territory or land, and generally you would be correct. The pagus functioned as a self-sufficient state with its own leaders, often a king, but consuls and councils were not uncommon, and it ran its own tax systems. But the pagus actually refers to a group of people, not any particular area. Thus, when looking at history, pagi sometimes seem to migrate and spread and move to better areas and opportunities. Pagi could contract their own deals and alliances. 2 to 12 pagi usually would form a larger unit, the civitae. Again, anyone with a passing understanding of Latin probably thinks that this means city or civilians, and in this case the term is actually more applicable. Civitates were a much more structured hierarchy in society, and generally centered around a central town, often a hill fort with a market attached, referred to as an opera, a ker, or dunum. Because these fortified cities were not mobile, the civitae was far less fluid, and more strictly defined in its territorial gains. Civitates would be the most recognizable as tribes, and sometimes combined with others to form even larger tribes. This is why Celtic records are often so frustrating. A tribe like the Cautovelani might be treated as a single entity, but it inhabits and assumes a tribe like the Camellani, who contract their own alliances, while independent leaders within the Cautovelani, but not within the Camellani, have other contracts entirely and sometimes fight the Camellani while being part of the Cautovelani. If that's frustrating for you, you can imagine what it's like trying to read this in Latin. I've never really understood why these types of situations seem so confusing, as almost every nation in the world has similar arrangements, from the Onondaga within the Iroquois in North America, all the way to the Kiryat within the Mongolians of the Sun Khanates. But the general principle is that political entities never seem to surrender more power than they need to. Thus, Pagae leaders operate as independent of the Civates and are not subservient to each other. So long as each has a say in the major decisions and pays tribute, this union of sorts remains. It becomes difficult to explain when a single large tribe becomes a confederacy of a number of tribes, but the general distinction seems to be that while an amalgamate tribe will have a single leader, a confederacy is often going to be headed by a ruling council with many tribal leaders. Celts often appear as a warrior culture, and this point can be argued. In the second millennia crisis, war and defense became central to survival. Hell, look at the Dorian Spartans or the Romans who emerged during the same period. And in war and society, Celtic life boiled down to the Vana, or the Viana, the war band. A group of lineaged warriors headed by a commanding chief, the war band were personal vehicles of glory and global vehicles of expansion. The independence allowed war bands were able to spread Celtic life widely, and it seems that the Pagus is derived, at least in part, from a settled warband. The situation would theoretically be as follows. The warband leaves its community Pagus and encounters opposing tribes. Using maneuverability and intimidation, the band is able to chase off the other tribes and seizes their land. At the point that they can defend the holdings they have now obtained, they become seen as their own Pagus. As their population grows, more warbands will be formed from that Pagus to gain more land and sican. As complex as this may sound, this system actually provided efficient organization. Keeping everything at length encouraged units to be efficient without a larger organizing society, and prevented the kind of collapse that followed the Bronze Age. This system of organization helps explain the question we asked earlier. Why did the Celts invade Britain? Celtic settlement, being organized around war, was a calculated strategic maneuver. The Celts began expanding westward around 800 BC, and among the first areas they secured were resource centres, namely the tin mines in Triol, Galicia, and Brittany. As bronze grew scarce, the man that controlled its components controlled war. Naturally, the Cornish tin mines were on the minds of Celts, but upland Britain offered many more bounties. Exposed copper and gold veins in Wales would have attracted their attention and made its owners rich, and Irish goldwork encouraged a fantasy of Irish wealth that lasted into the Roman period. Many of the Iberian and Portuguese stories of a fabled land in the west filled with gold probably have their roots during this period. As the conquest of Gaul was finished, many Celtic eyes would have turned to Britain. And yet, as John Davies has pointed out, although the Celts would have been present in Britain by around 700 BC, there's no evidence of a large-scale invasion during this period. Instead, it would seem that a population of merchants and small warriors set themselves up as rulers over a native population. This helps explain some reports of a British language being distinct from Gaulish, and aspects of British culture differing from Gallic, such as the continued use of war chariots while Gaul had turned largely towards cavalry. But despite the flagrant differences between these groups, Britons were still Celts, well, because Celts never really existed. The idea of a Celtic or a Gallic people was a fairly recent invention, roughly from the late Roman conquest of the 1st century BC. In the Pagus or the Civate, everyone else was an outsider. This accounts for the fractured defense of Gaul that allowed Caesar to conquer the nation. But this lack of ethnicity held its own benefits. Because prowess and resources counted for more than blood, some Pagae could be completely non-Celtic peoples, Belgic Teutons, Aquitanian Basques, or Armorican Britons, who lived in a Celtic framework and culture. Without a nation barrier, individual Pagae could pursue contacts well beyond the Celtic world, expanding their range of alliances and networks and fostering trade. Ah yes, trade. I've resented labeling the Celts as a warrior culture, even though much of their politics was organized around it. Across the world, the title of warrior culture encourages this idea of an essentially primitive people good at fighting and very little else. But in order to be adept at war, a culture needs to master so many other skills. And among the Celts, metalwork, infrastructure, and trade bloomed, often intermingling and helping to influence their war. Though famous for their roads, the Romans only really began constructing the Appian Way after contact with the Celts in the 4th century BC, and Celtic roads predating Roman ones tied together the Pyrenees, Gaul, the Alps, and the Rhine in a way that would not be seen again until the 1200s. The trade connections along these roads and beyond them stretched from Archony to Armenia, and it was from Armenia that the Celts probably learned to work iron. This can't be understated. In the 800s, very few cultures knew how to work iron, namely the Hittites, the Armenians, and the Celts. So, to the average Basque or Briton facing these warriors, not only were the Celts supreme in logistics, tactics, trade, and ferocity, but they were also equipped with the technology 100 years ahead of its time. For Scotland, this technology was a godsend. Like bronze before it, iron could plough the rocky Scottish soil, but unlike its predecessor, the ubiquity of iron ensured that the Scottish populations could boom and outlast their overlords. As mentioned before, the Celtic population in Scotland would never have been very high, and their influence wanes as one moves north, but their farming prowess developed the first Celtic kingdoms in the lowlands, the Texali, the Novante, and the Votadini. Up to this, we've only spoken of Scotland incidentally, and while we'll try to focus on that, the dearth of local evidence often pushes us to look at other sites. In general, Scottish Celts were adept farmers and warriors, maintained trade ties with the continent and Scandinavia, and developed a strong bardic tradition in place of writing. All of this seems very similar to what we've mentioned before, in addition to the British tradition of war chariots also mentioned. Scotland also maintained a larger fishing economy than most other Celts, a remnant of the Neolithic life. However, the Celts we've considered mostly are grouped as Gauls and Britons, Ireland being a different beast entirely. I've decided to divide this topic into 2 episodes, this one covering the origins and politics of the Celts, focused on the Gauls and the Britons, the second dealing more with their society and culture, and focusing on the Irish and the Picts. Scotland lay at the crossroads between all of these cultures, and each one left a different mark on the country. And we've seen so far a very different image of the Celts. They were effective leaders and warriors, adept settlers and traders, with technology and structures in advance of their neighbours. True to their disparate pagae, Celtic leadership was very flexible, with kings as often as queens, democratic council, and collective grain and wealth security. Rulers maintained control by maintaining their image, often appearing ostentatious or boastful. A leader gathered war loot and riches as evidence of his prosperity, evidence that was often passed down to us when they tried to take it into the next world. Leaders often maintained a class of bards to sing of the great deeds by which they had obtained their loot. In these 2 ways, leaders maintained their strength, and in their strength they maintained their rule. Unlike modern political systems, where the authority of a position invests power in the people who use it, in Celtic kingship, its rulers had to empower the office. The strength of a king determined the strength of his position as king. This theory does become complicated somewhat by confederacies, but control was maintained with other mechanisms in these, usually a council of many kings. As the conquest of Britain waned in the 600s BC, the warbands and tribes began to consolidate their holdings on the island. For one reason or another, the richest areas such as Wales and Cornwall, well, there's a phrase you don't hear of a lot, remained in the hands of small fanes and in a state of almost perpetual gang war over the resources. But by the mid-500s, major oppida and duns indicate that there was a level of control and defense superseding simple tribes across Britain. And a side note for anyone who's really into word meanings, a ker, often written as Latin castar and Saxon chestar, was a fortified administrative centre, often housing the tribal leadership and wealth. It's similar to a castle. A dunum, or a Latin dunum, was more obviously a fortress. It may have been a place of retreat during a time of war, and usually inhabited a defensible position but was not always lived in. Thus, the building of a ker would indicate the establishment of a new administration in the area, while a dum indicates consolidation within that area. While early Britain would have been dominated by Civates, Mainau around Edinburgh, Dic Angli in Gwynedd, and the Iceni in Norfolk, by the 500s confederacies had begun to dominate Britain. Theories as to why these groups range from native uprisings to Belgian invasions to just monopolies, but for the purposes of this episode, I'm going to look at the unusual step of actually not indulging in fantastic theory. Suffice to say, the Britons began consolidating their holdings. It's difficult to say where the confederacies began. It would make sense that threats to trade from the coasts would encourage alliances in Sussex, for instance, but evidence from the period is sparse, and the greatest of the Southern Confederacies probably only began to exist around 250 BC. Extrapolating about these confederacies is much easier, so I'm going to try and focus on them. In Gaul, the arrival of the foreign Celtic group, the Belgae, sparked a formation of a number of large alliances that partitioned Gaul, the Aedui, the Helvetii, and the Arverni. I probably said all of those wrong, someone can correct me in the comments. The Belgic kings also seized parts of southern England. this was the first real Celtic invasion we can point to, and they established new kingdoms in the region. These states coalesced into a single confederacy sometime around 100 BC, probably around the mythic kings Belgae and Lud, but by the time of Cymbalanius, or Cymbeline, around 60 BC, they certainly did exist. The centralization of southern Britain would have sparked similar confederacies that swept north. The Coritani and Cornovi took over the Midlands, and the greatest of the British confederacies, the Brigante. As mentioned before, the Brigante probably date back to the mid-500s BC, but it appears that the centralized state of the 1st century BC was fairly new, with groups such as the Carvetti sharing a common history but no current political union. It seems clear, however, that the Celts and the peoples of the north saw the Brigante as a threat to their expansion. The Ottadini began to swallow up smaller neighbours such as Mainau, and established a buffer zone against the Brigantes. This stalled Celtic advancement in Scotland. In turn, facing the Ottadini, the northern tribes coalesced into the first identifiably Scottish people, the Caledonian Confederacy. When I began this episode, the Caledoni appeared to be Britons, much like the Ottadini and their other neighbours, but by the time of the Roman conquest, and certainly by the time that I drafted this script, the Caledonian isolation had fostered an entirely new culture, one that we will cover in the next video, where warlords, faeries, and cattle vie to shape this new Scottish identity.